Hello guys, this is Caitlin, again with Historian Stitch, doing part 2 to our first how-to video. This is our second one now. Um, Basically, since we have gone over the 4 basic stitches, basically these 4 at the top, we are now going to be doing the last 2, that being the button stitch, which we will be going over 2 of them, as well as a patchwork. As we go through our process of wearing everything, we tend to wear holes in them, which means patching is necessary. Now, today, there is the handy little thing of going to the store, buying iron-on patches, and just ironing that on and going on your way. However, they don't last very long. You still need at least a little bit of stitching if you want it to last for much longer than a couple months. So I will be showing you the hand stitching way. Now, just like with the original 4 stitches, you need the simple things of thread, your scissors, which I have currently lost, there they are, your scissors. Again, they will be attached at my waist, so you probably won't be seeing too much of them, as well as a needle. Now, I have actually found my smallest needle possible now. It was actually attached into the garment that I will be working on while showing you all how to do buttons and buttonholes. So yeah, we will start from there. We are going to start with the patch first. Now, obviously, on our sample swatch here, this is not the kind of patch that you necessarily want to patch with. In most cases, you obviously want to have material as close to, if not the same exact color as the main body of your garment or blanket or whatever you were patching. But for the simplicity of this and to make sure that you guys can see it, we are using dark purple on my linen cloth here. Obviously, there is a very large hole that needs fixed. This is a sample in comparison to some things. Usually when things wear out, they look more like, give me just a moment. Look more like holes like that, where you have threads that are still attached. You've also got very rough edging. Basically, that rough edging is what you were covering up. This hole has not gotten to that point yet. This is a mishap with the scissors rather than a wear through. But that is the hole that we were patching nonetheless, and I will thread my needle. We are using this peachy pink again so that it shows up on the purple, and we will go from there. Now I will show you guys how to tie the beginning knot one more time, just to kind of reiterate how that works, and then I will show you how to pin this down, or at least how I pin it down, and then we will go from there. So I have my needle threaded. Um, Obviously it is very bent, just from general use. I use this one for literally everything. But before I tie my knot, I would like to mention something that I completely forgot in the last video, that there are 2 ways you can thread your needle, or 2 ways you can tie them once you've threaded it at least. Basically, you can either have a double thread, like what I have here, you can see the kind of doubling at the end there, or you can just use a single strand. Single strands I tend to use for really long seams that aren't going to have much wear, where you only have the one. For patches, for cuffs, for neck bands, things like that, I tend to use the double, just because that, at least in my experience, does make it at least a little bit stronger. Nonetheless, in most cases, if you plan on doing this more than just once in a blue moon, the best way to make sure that your thread is nice and strong is to use beeswax. Once you have, if you choose to use beeswax, you basically just run it through the block a couple times to make sure that it's thoroughly waxed. and that helps hold all of the fibers down so that they won't pull apart in the process of you sewing. Um, so, like I said before, we are going to go over how to tie the first knot here again. So, once again, wet your thread, wrap it around your finger, roll it off the end of your finger. Make sure that it has plenty of spring to it, plenty of twist, and you just pull it tight. Once you've pulled it tight, you should have something akin to this little knot. If you didn't quite get it, try again and again. Eventually it will work, I assure you. When I was first learning how to tie this particular knot, it took me a few tries. But now the second step to this is to pin down our patch. When I'm pinning down patches, in most cases my patch itself isn't neatly ironed. One part of this one is, so I'm just going to leave that one where it is. And when you're patching, you want your patch to be slightly bigger than the hole itself. That way, you're thoroughly covering it, you have enough room for that patch to wiggle and possibly get bigger. Hopefully not, but possibly. And when you put the patch itself on, you're going to tuck under these raw edges. So in this case, this bottom side is very rough. You can see where it's pulling apart. You want to tuck that under. Now I'm going to tuck it about 1/4 of an inch under. That way I've still got enough room to fit around the patch. I did not fit around the hole. I didn't cut this patch quite big enough. But basically you just pin that down, and once I have that done, we will go from there. I have it pinned down. Basically I just have all 4 sides just as flatly as possible pinned. If you look at the back, you can see that purple coming through. And basically we're going to straight stitch all along that. That straight stitch helps hold it down. Because it's a patch, it doesn't have to look perfect. Once again, unlike what we were doing in this sample, your thread and your patch itself should match what you're attaching it to. So you don't really have to worry about how ugly or offsetting it'll look. I failed to put my thimble on. But that's the basis for how we're going to go around the edge of this. Now this is another one of those. There are probably 30 different ways of patching and how to properly patch depending on what you're looking at and what era you're working in. But across the board, this is one of those methods that everybody has used at one point or another. My apologies, the window is open and I can hear things going on outside. But because this method is used in every era, this is the one I tend to use the most, or choose to use the most. It also tends to lay much flatter. So if your shirt has a hole in it, whether it be under the arms or somewhere near there, this will lay flat enough that it shouldn't be too noticeable, and it won't be uncomfortable. Now, one problem with patches that I have found is if it is a garment that has been washed and worn, and washed and worn, and washed and worn, you will come into the problem of the patch itself is not near as stretchy or flexible as the material you have attached it to. And when that happens, there isn't much you can do about it, except to continue washing and wearing the bit of clothing. I did that for a pair of pockets in one of my favorite pairs of jeans and had that problem. Eventually you just kind of get used to it and it'll wear itself out into the same shape. as the rest of the garment itself. Now, in case you have forgotten, your straight stitch is basically that up and down motion through the patch itself. It should look the same on the front as it does the back, where we have this bright pink section here that is your straight stitch. Basically just the up and down motion. Once you get to the end, which I have 2.5 more sides to do here, once we get to the end, I will show you how to tie that last knot, and then we will start on the whip stitching in the middle. That middle section is actually what stabilizes the hole itself that you are patching. So, alright, so we have got all 4 sides essentially sewn down. Now we need to do the middle one, but before we can do that much of this patch, we need to tie our first knot down at down here at the bottom. My apologies, I can't seem to talk today. So just like in the last video, my version of tying your last knot is to pull up some of the thread. See if I can do this so that you all can see it this time. Wrap around one side. When you've wrapped around that one side, correction, let me explain this in a different way. Okay. So, one of these days I will have a better setup than this. So, pull the needle back out of the loop. We have our big loop, we have the needle. When you poke the needle through the big loop, continue holding the thread on this side and pull the big loop down. Now that the loop is on this side and your needle's on this side, poke it through that big loop, hold the thread here, pull it tight. You do that 3 to 4 times, but rather than tack it down like I would in any other case, I'm going to leave this thread attached. With patches, because if the center of the patch fails, then the rest of the patch is going to fail anyway. I tend to just leave it all attached together. So I'm going to tuck the needle under and just kind of poke it between our 2 pieces of fabric here, towards the center hole. Just kind of letting it peek through again right before the very edge. From there, you just pull it all the way through, and we are going to whip stitch around the edge. Now, when you're doing the center of a patch, you could just whip stitch it like we are, which in this case it's more of a hem stitch, just without tucking the edges under. You only want to grab a few stitches. Well, you only want to grab those few little stitches there before poking back up through your main body, to kind of close up that hole and tack it down. I just lost my train of thought. Now during the different variations of this, you could do a buttonhole stitch. You could do what some people call a horse blanket stitch, where you act like it's going to be a normal stitch, just poke it through, but you wrap this loop around once and pull it. That gives a straight section of just thread to kind of help bury that raw edge. Kind of cover that a little bit with the buttonholes. That's actually how I thought buttonhole stitches were meant to be to begin with. 90% of my garments thus far have had just a horse blanket stitch on them. It wasn't until essentially this past winter when I was taught very different things to an 18th century coat for work, But basically with this patch, you're going to go all the way around the edge till you come back to that very first whip stitch that you've made, tie off your knot, and then you're going to go from there. Basically your patch will be fairly secure at that point. It takes a good year or two before any of my patches that are made this way come undone. And we will now go to the buttons and buttonholes. Before we move on to the buttons and buttonholes, I'd like to show you our finished product of the patch we've done. You can see the pink straight stitch up here, and along the other four sides is our straight stitch, and then this oval in the circle is where we have tied down this back side. You can see how it is much smoother now. Me rubbing my finger over it isn't pulling the material up anymore, so it'll hold stronger for at least a little while longer. So for the buttons and buttonholes, I have 5 buttons to put on this shirt that I've been working on for a while. It does not have the sleeves attached yet. I realized before making this video that putting the buttons and buttonholes on would actually be much easier, simpler to do without the sleeves attached, so I can actually hold on to it than it would be if they were attached. So basically, before we start doing the attaching of buttons or cutting of buttonholes, you need an additional tool, and that would be a small ruler. I have a seamstress's tailor's ruler. Basically for this, you want to have a measurement of about how big your button is. So in this case I have 3/4 of an inch buttons to put on this shirt. And then to make sure that that button will fit through the buttonhole, you want to add about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to have about an inch long buttonholes, not buttons. Now, in most patterns, if you are making a garment, it will have exactly where to put these buttonholes and the buttons themselves. So with that, you just kind of lay it down exactly where the pattern tells you to. You cut right there, and you go on your merry way of fixing those buttonholes and the buttons themselves. Now, if you are reattaching buttons or replacing some, you kind of have to go off of where the button used to be, or I have seen buttons replacing hook and eyes. If you were doing that, you go exactly where the hook and eye used to be, unless there were a good 15-20 in the bodice itself, at which point you get to play around and figure out what exactly you want it to look like. Now in this case, I have 4 to go along this front placket here, and then 1 in each of the sleeves. We are going to start with these 4, since this is the main body of the shirt is in my lap right now. I'm going to measure out where I need them to go. I have a vague idea of where they go, and then we will go through and cut them out. So with these buttonholes, I do not have a fabric pen up here at the moment, so I am using just my regular needles. Once you have your buttonholes marked, I already have one cut because that one was going to be a funky one. You go to the other side of your material where it doesn't have the pins yet, and mark exactly where those buttons should go. Now whether you put them farther in or closer to the edge of your material is entirely up to you, depending on how tightly or loosely fit you want it to be. In this case, I'm going to put it somewhere closer to the middle, probably. If the person whom I am making this for wants them moved, I'm fairly positive that he can sew, so he can either do it himself, or I would gladly move them around for him. Same for any other garment that I have ever made. Just a moment. So just to kind of differentiate for myself and for you guys, obviously my buttonholes are going sideways for where they will be. My buttons themselves are going up and down, using the heads of my pins to be the marker for where I want the button to sit. That way I know exactly where to go with it. Now for the buttonholes themselves, I admit I am really bad about this. I have a tendency to not actually measure where I'm cutting or how far I need to cut. Mainly for this reason, because I lose things. Again, we're doing an inch long, which in this case would actually take up the entirety of my placket. So we are not doing an inch anymore. We are going to trim that down just a little bit, probably about an eighth smaller than it should be. And basically how I cut these is I will fold it in half, placket itself that is, fold it in half and then cut there. In most cases, I do not go through the entire process of measuring and checking. Usually I just go through, cut out the buttonholes, and shove one of my buttons through to make sure it fits. If it does, I continue cutting the same way I did the first time. In this case, because of the way we are doing these videos, it fit. So I have my buttonhole here, and basically, you want the button to be able to just kind of sit, but not so snugly that you can't move it all the way through. If you can't push the button all the way through, your buttonhole is far too small. You need to make it a little bit bigger, and if it basically just falls out of the buttonhole, you can't just have it sit there nicely. It's a little bit too big, at which point you can't fix it. There might be a few ways you could fix that, but there's not really a good way to make it look nice while fixing it. So we are going to go through and cut the rest of these. But I feel it is relatively important to mention this small tidbit. I can't, for the life of me, remember exactly where I read this, but interesting fact about buttons and buttonholes is buttons themselves were invented long before the buttonhole was. Buttonholes were not added until later when somebody finally realized that, hey, we could use this to actually close our garments rather than just using the blanket pins. And that would hold true for a very long time. In most cases, it was only men's clothing that you would find buttons on and buttonholes. Even in the 19th century, many women's dresses would have decorative buttons everywhere, but they wouldn't have too many buttons themselves, mainly because the stereotypes of the time did not qualify women enough to let them dress themselves essentially, which granted, after wearing all of the layers that they did, some of those dresses are very difficult to get in by yourself. You definitely need the extra help. Whereas in other cases, if it is a work dress, you don't really have to worry about it too much. Actually, with work dresses, you see far more buttons being used rather than hooks and eyes. But I have my buttonholes cut here. Originally, I thought I was going to go through and show two ways of doing this. We're actually going to stick to one. Now, the one that I do looks very rounded. Looks actually I did it on my swatch here. This, it looks very rounded. It still lays flat. It lays straight. It does what it's supposed to. But depending on the time period, this one is not accurate. The other version of this would be bookended looking. Basically, you have the general stitch along the edges, these, but once you get to the top and bottom, you have a flatter spot that you're stitching along the same way, but it doesn't look the same. I will actually attach a video to the bottom of this one if you are curious as to how that works. I believe the guy who is working on making that kind of buttonhole works at Williamsburg, so fairly accurate source. In the case of these, because they are 19th century, we're just doing the simple rounded edge. And I will thread my buttonhole and we will go on. I have my needle threaded. Because this is a buttonhole, I am using a single thread rather than the double. And basically for this, I'm going to start at the bottom, work my way up. Mainly because when I am doing buttonholes, the first one I do tends to look very ugly compared to the rest of them as I work my way up the garment. Now for security of stitch, I'm going to start at the most inward point of my garment, in this case closer to the sleeve side, and you want to be on the inside, not the outside. That way you have a cleaner stitch. Now for a buttonhole, you kind of leave your buttonhole itself open, poke your needle through the buttonhole itself, and back up out the side. So something akin to, lighting here is terrible today, something akin to that. Now once you have your needle outside again, you're going to take your extra thread and wrap it around twice. That wrapping around twice is actually what makes this a button stitch. Now, to begin with, I've been calling the other version of this stitch a horse blanket stitch, but it is also called a blanket stitch. Either case does hold all of your material together and kind of fasten off that raw edge. However, the blanket stitch doesn't have a knot attached, unlike this stitch, which that double wrapping of the needle is actually what makes that second knot. That knot, so poke it through, wrap it twice, and it works kind of like our beginning knot, where you have it wrapped around your finger, roll it off, you have all of those spins. Those spins you are creating on your needle rather than on your finger. So basically the same concept. You do that all the way around the edge until you get to the end, at least the end of this side. And then we will do kind of a 90-degree turn, where you've got this end up here, that last cut spot, you're going to go through and up into it, about the middle of that hole, do a buttonhole stitch, and then continue down the other side as you did for your original side. Now once you're at the end, you flip it inside out one more time so all of your knots are to the inside, and do your seesaw knot, is what I will dub that one now. Now, for the sake of time, I am going to finish this particular buttonhole later and the other ones attached. And I will show you guys I will show you one version, my particular favorite version of attaching buttons, but there are two. At least in the case of the kind of button that I'm using now. The buttons I am using are simple wood ones. You can see the 4 holes in it there. 90% of good quality work shirts and stuff are going to have 4 buttonhole buttons. The 2-hole ones you will find more on women's clothing, oddly enough. Just a little side note there. But when you're looking at these buttons, you can either have them looking like an 11, where all of the stitching is on this side, as well as this side, there is no X in the middle, or you can have the X. Now, personally, I like the X version. It kind of holds the button down a little bit more than the 11. And on the back, if you're doing the 11, you have the X on the back instead of the front. That X on the back actually weakens the material. It kind of bunches it together compared to the 11 on the back, which just holds down the material on both sides of the buttonhole. On both sides of the button. Correction. Oh. So I have my needle still threaded. This time I am doubling it. I double my buttons, but I single my buttonholes, mainly because your buttons are going to be taking the brunt of the force of wear, at least compared to the buttonhole itself. Now, once again, I have my pinhead here. I'm going to go somewhere about the middle with that pinhead. And your knots are all going to be on the back side once again. In this case, it just makes life easier. That way you're already starting to hold down your button. The first few stitches are always the most painstaking because your button is going to be moving around. This is kind of a tedious task anyway because when you're poking back up through the backside, you have here, when you're poking back through that backside where my needle is now, you have to be able to poke through the hole you want it to go through. In general, it's just kind of an aggravating thing, but after a little while you'll get used to it, and it actually goes much quicker than you think it will. So, for each passing through each hole of the button, I do it anywhere from 3 to 5 times. I am actually kind of quite proud of my strong buttons with only 3 passes through. If you can't get your stitching quite tight enough for that, that is okay. Just switch over to the 5 or higher. Just don't go any higher than 10. To buy garments straight from the store, you will see that they are poked through a good 10 to 12 times, which does not make the button stronger. That actually just means that they never tied a knot in the thread. So they are more likely to get pulled off eventually. But that is the basis for how to put on a buttonhole and how to make buttonholes and put on a button, as well as how to patch a garment. So the next video that we will probably be doing, no promises as to next Wednesday, but a future Wednesday, will be quite possibly how to make masks. Now in our typical way here at Historian Stitch, it will probably be a historic mask, maybe. But other than that, please put in the comments what you would like to learn. I have a few ideas going in my head at this point, but ultimately it's up to you guys as to what you want to learn and what you would rather just not see ever again. So, thanks.